So across the lands between, there's few things as instantly recognizable as a living jar. Found in numerous catacombs and legacy dungeons, and even a settlement all their own called Jarburg, these guys could be considered one of the mascots for Elden Ring, given how much they were focused on during the marketing. But what is a jar's purpose? Why were these dudes made, and who made them? In my opinion, this is one of Elden Ring's greater mysteries, and we only have a few clues to go on, but let's get into it. So everybody knows the journey of Alexander the Warrior Jar, the Iron Fist. Hailing from the peaceful settlement of Jarburg, he eventually set off on a journey to become a champion. And despite getting stuck in some embarrassingly Siegward-style situations, his resolve never faltered, and his journey would take him all across the lands between to various different landmarks and locations, until finally reaching crumbling Farum Azula, which was a place that most champions never saw. Most of them perished before they even made it to the mountaintops, managing to harvest pieces of Radon and the last living fire giant in the process. Of course, as we all know, this is where Alexander's story meets its end, but that doesn't seem to bother him too much. As he puts it, all vessels are destined to break. But this warrior's death at what amounts to as the edge of the world, a place that only a handful of the beings from the lands between will ever truly see, is a more than worthy death for someone like Alexander. And likewise, we learn from Jar Baron that all warrior jars are destined to go on these great journeys, searching for powerful opponents to defeat and put inside the jar, essentially eat. But where do all these other warrior jars meet their end? We know most of them aren't as powerful or as legendary as Alexander, so they likely didn't make it even half as far. Well, except for the Great Jar, that is. That guy, we'll get into him later. But no, most of these warrior jars seem to die at the hands of Erdtree avatars, which is pretty unceremonious when you really think about it. Erdtree avatars fucking suck. But at several minor Erdtrees, we can see that they're kind of like a graveyard of fallen warrior jars. And at some of these locations, there's been some opportunistic trolls that have recycled these jar husks into big-ass bombs that they throw at travelers. Gotta love those troll innovations. But yeah, at a number of these minor Erdtrees, there's what amounts to be a graveyard of dead warrior jars. And that's where I started theorizing that maybe after every warrior jar eats a good number of powerful warriors, they then head to a minor Erdtree to square off against an Erdtree avatar. The Erdtree avatar is armed with a club that can easily shatter a jar, but after the jar is defeated, his contents are then used as fertilizer and soil for this minor Erdtree, which in a way gives these fallen warriors an Erdtree burial, returning them in some form or some way to the Erdtree itself. And then I started thinking, well, could this have been why the jars were created? I mean, they've got an Erdtree seal on that lid of theirs, and it honestly seems like something the Greater Will or the Golden Order would come up with. They are definitely not above this kind of shit. I mean, think about it. Create a race, if you can call it that, of beings that are essentially enchanted pots. Incept the idea into their little minds that they must set out and defeat powerful warriors and fill their jar with the remains. And then when they reach capacity, perhaps they're programmed to seek out this Erdtree avatar. Now this kind of brings me back to Alexander's final comments, which gives us some insight into the living jar's views on mortality when he says that all vessels are destined to break. So in a way, these warrior jars know they're built to die, that dying is part of their purpose. It's almost like the idea was incepted into their brain. Or on the contrary, it could just be part of that culture that they've developed in response to their programming. Which honestly, I like that a lot better, especially when you look at lines about them being better than their makers. Like, they're super friendly and they have no reason to be, and I think that that's really interesting. But unfortunately for the jars, they were created as sort of a scheme. They were essentially designed to gather high-grade fertilizer for these minor Erdtrees, but like in the bloodiest way possible. And if that's not enough, they made the jars think that this is their divine purpose to do this. And I guess in a sense it is. I mean, their god gave them this purpose, and if that's not divine purpose, I don't know what is. But when you start looking at it, you realize it's less divine purpose and sounds like a passive way to track down all wayward warriors and eventually return them to the Erdtree. Since as far as we know, the Erdtree likes powerful souls to, well, recycle or do whatever the fuck it does with them. Feed them to the Elden Beast or Greater Will? Who knows? We do know that people are reincarnated, so maybe that isn't the case. Maybe the thing just likes to process them. I mean, that's a whole subject for another video entirely. But I don't know, I could be all wrong about all of this, but it's just something that came to mind while I was thinking about the living jars. The friendliness and the code of honor they've developed appears to have been all on their own, or maybe just from the interactions of the warriors they were encountering over the, however long period of time it has been since they were created and the start of the game. So it seems like this culture of theirs developed in response to their programming. They seem like a project that was created a long time ago and was kind of just abandoned and left to its own devices by the events of the game. And yeah, the same could be said about a number of enemies in this game, namely the Albinaurics, or even like the demi-humans. The jars themselves are said to be better than their creators, or maybe they became better than their creators. And we see this in how polite they are. Look at the ones at Jarburg. While we could only talk to one of them, the other ones don't seem to mind you at all, and they seem to accept Dialos rather openly. But the ones at Jarburg appear to be different than the average jars you encounter at places like Volcano Manor, or even Alexander himself. I like to think that these jars are filled with the contents of maybe artisans and gardeners as opposed to warriors, because they seem to have no desire to go seek out conflict. Maybe a few of them, probably the bigger ones, are like retired warrior jars, but have since abandoned their warrior ways. Maybe they're like the village elders or something. But it's likely that they teach peace and pacifism over conflict. And even Jarbairn says that he's secretly a warrior jar. So maybe this is just a pacifist community of jars, which would explain why Alexander left in the first place to set out on his rather violent journey. Now, one thing I've also wondered about these jars is, do the jars themselves grow, or do they do some kind of transplanting when they get too much fertilizer to a bigger jar, or what's going on there? So since there's no straight up answer, and it appears that they don't ever really do any kind of transplanting, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the jars do grow, which could only be explained by the magical nature of the jar's existence. I mean, look, they're capable of sight and speech but don't have any eyes or mouth. So why can't they be made of a sentient-like jar that grows as it's filled with fertilizer? A great example would be the great jar that I mentioned earlier. I mean, there's no way his innards were transplanted from a smaller jar to a bigger jar, and then he just went around as that bigger jar collecting more fertilizer. And I don't think that happened. I think he defeated too many people in front of that arena. He essentially ate too many powerful beings to the point where he grew to a size where he couldn't even move. And that's why when we see him, we don't really challenge him to a fight. He just summons warriors that he's eaten in the past. Plus, he's also indestructible at this point, so there's really no point in engaging anybody in combat when you can't be destroyed and can't use your legs. The Great Jar's Arsenal talisman seems to support this, however vaguely, with the description stating, carry as much as you can to grow big and strong. So to me it sounds like they can grow, but I'm sure others may have different interpretations. And I mean, the jars must have some kind of magical properties because they're highly sought after for their jar shards by both poachers and depraved perfumers, who use these shards to create perfumes that give them the ability to turn into Metal Mario. Well, briefly that is, just like Mario 64. This would also explain why the non-pacifist living jars tend to take up residence in places like catacombs or legacy dungeons, even the sewers beneath Landell, living amongst rather powerful monsters, as an added layer of protection against these poachers. So yeah, the living jars are basically divine, sentient fertilizer gatherers and containers that were created and given sentience only to be shattered by their creators and used as fertilizer, rather unceremoniously built to be destroyed. And while we're on the subject of being built to be destroyed, there's also the black living jars, or the fire jars. While they are capable of saying the N-word, their main source of attack is to ignite themselves and kamikaze you. I can only assume their contents are the same as any other jar, except with a hefty dose of explosive and flammable oil whipped into the mix. These jars are much rarer than the average living jars or the big living jars, often found in the odd catacomb or in the lava pits beneath Volcano Manor, hanging out with other fire jars and living jars alike, watching a large living jar teaching a young living jar how to do that spin attack they always do. But that's all I really wanted to get into on this one. As always, I hope you guys found it at least somewhat informative. If you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me rant on and on and on, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel, especially in these rather unfortunate YouTube days. I know, I'll get out the world's smallest violin. But without further ado, let's get to our outro. So I'm trying to get back into my old, more frequent upload schedule, and let me just say, God of War is not making it any easier. I definitely plan on covering some lore topics from God of War because so far I've already uncovered a lot of things that definitely are video worthy, and I generally like their take on Norse mythology. It's very different, but very familiar at the same time. But as always, I'll see you guys next time, and be safe. See ya.
My thanks. I knew you were the stuff of champions. It was a marvelous battle. I implore you, take what I bequeath from inside me. All vessels are destined to one day break. But the great Alexander lived as a warrior to his last.